16K, that was the previous low point. That pattern of diminishing returns was going to show 4 to 5x 65, 70K if that pattern held true. We're blowing through that pattern right now. So when someone says diminishing returns, they could mean it different ways, but at least in that particular pattern of diminishing returns, like it's already done. That would still be such a massive signal to the rest of the world that the United States is saying, hey, we are going to hold 200,000 Bitcoin for the foreseeable future. And you would have to assume they're going to actively start buying into that and adding to it at some point, even if they can't do it for some political reasons on day one. If Bitcoin could double, triple, quadruple from here, that's the crazy thing. It still is a drop in the bucket, really, compared to the dollar system. So that doesn't really threaten the dollar system, but if it happens too quickly, those powers that be could start to maybe worry that there's going to be a flight out of the dollar, and they don't really want that. So I don't think they want to signal and say, but I'm pretty sure what the Trump administration is not going to do is say, look at all this inflation, we need to cut entitlement spending and jack up interest rates. So, if you're not willing to do that, then I think you get into the melt up, more debt, more inflation.
Mr. John Haar, thank you so much for being a playable character in a sea of non-playable characters and joining me here today, sir. Thank you so much.
Great to be here, Brandon. We've chatted before, officially on the pod and many times off the pod. So always pumped to chat with you, man.
Always. And if for anyone who doesn't know John, which he should at this point, he's very active on Twitter. He is part of the private client services at Swan Bitcoin, and he was a former Wall Street portfolio manager and institutional investor of 13 years. And more importantly, he's a family man, and he is a former hockey player, as am myself. So yes, we have many things to talk about. So thank you for joining me. Well, let's get into the topics of the day. Obviously, last week, Donald Trump. I would love for you to go into why the Donald Trump, the significance. We talked offline about David Bailey, the team of people he had to orange pill President Trump, and this nation state adoption that really, Bitcoiners have been pontificating, theorizing for years. Really for 15 years here, obviously, and it's already seemingly coming to fruition, right? Nation states are adopting. There's legal tender. These things have happened. Now, the biggest, largest economy in the world is seemingly right here on the precipice. So I'd love for you to dive into what you're seeing and what it means for all of us moving forward.
Yeah, for sure, man. It's kind of hard to overstate how big some of these things appear to be, at least. And we're not even a week after Trump winning the election. And, Bitcoin has gone from roughly 70 to now 83 that we're talking about here. But I don't want to obsess too much about like what the price is at a specific moment in time, but it's more so what actually has happened and what we're probably on the doorstep of. And like you said, this it's been a theory. It's been talked about. Oh, nation states are eventually going to buy Bitcoin. Big companies are eventually going to buy Bitcoin. And it's more like, okay, El Salvador did it. Okay, MicroStrategy did it. Okay, this other tiny company bought a little bit. And it was just like, a little bit here and there. Okay, Bhutan is mining Bitcoin and they're keeping it. Like all these little things that they matter, but they're pretty small. Now we're on the doorstep of the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world. It seems like at the very least, it's going to be easy for them to say, hey, I think it's roughly 200,000 Bitcoin that they own, that they're just going to say, we're not selling it, we're holding it. That seems like a super easy thing for them to do. And that would just say, that's the beginning of our strategic Bitcoin reserve or stockpile. I think Trump likes the word stockpile. We'll see if he gets that to stick. But I think that's super easy. And even if they just do that, even if they just say we're holding the 200,000 Bitcoin that we have, we're not actively buying because let's just say they can't for some reason because it requires congressional approval. It's just too difficult. Let's just assume that. That would still be such a massive signal to the rest of the world that the United States is saying, hey, we are going to hold 200,000 Bitcoin for this foreseeable future. And you would have to assume they're going to actively start buying into that and adding to it at some point, even if they can't do it for some political reasons on day one. So, I mean, I think things switch from, not that long ago, if you brought up Bitcoin to an institutional investor, a financial advisor, a high net worth individual, a family office, they might have laughed at you and just said, it's kind of ridiculous. It's a Ponzi scheme. It has no cash flow, no earnings. The government's going to ban it, blah, blah. We know the whole list. And you would have been kind of laughed at. And now it's happened, gradually then suddenly, I think applies here for sure. There was, the ETF launches, BlackRock's behind it, BlackRock's making presentations about it. So that's those are big deals. But now I think we're approaching the point where all those people I just listed off, institutional investors, that means, insurance companies, pensions, endowments, those are the big ones, but hedge funds you could throw in there as well. High net worth individuals, family offices, financial advisors. Now we're getting to the point where all of them, I think, are going to have conversations and they're going to say, wait a minute, the US government just signaled to us that they're at least holding their $200,000 worth of Bitcoin for strategic reasons. And now you're telling me we own zero of this thing? Oh, and by the way, it's the best performing asset this year. It's the best performing asset last year and the best performing asset for 7 out of 10 calendar years, soon to be 8 out of 11. It's like, why do we not own some of this thing? And then you think about all those entities I listed off, most of them still are on zero. Most of them have not even said, let's dip our toe with a 1% allocation here. So you start to think about that. And then there's rumors on Twitter that there are nation states actively buying, like literally right now. Some people are throwing, and you never know, rumors could be false, but I saw some people saying, hey, this, there is a nation state actively buying. It's going to be announced soon. And to be honest with you, the price action would kind of make sense. Seeing this pretty massive pump over the weekend. This doesn't seem like just one guy buying some Bitcoin and stopping. This seems like indiscriminate buying. And they just said, yeah, we know the price is going to run up, but we're putting a big position on here because we think, the difference between 70 and 80K is nothing in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, putting all that together. And then, like you said, huge credit to David Bailey and the Bitcoin Magazine team for getting in Trump's ear on this. There's another thread we could pull on if you want to, but the hypothetical alternative world of if Trump and Pence got in 2020, we could probably have a whole show on that because I think Elon never buys Twitter. I think Trump never is incentivized to care about Bitcoin. So I think the way that it played out with Trump getting in now in 2024 is just completely different world. I mean, the whole team he assembled, right? RFK, Tulsi, Vivek, JD Vance, Howard Lutnick, Elon being outspoken on his side, David Sachs, Silicon Valley billionaires. I don't think any of that stuff happens. Maybe some of it. Most of it does not happen if Trump and Pence get in 2020. So I think we're just in a completely different world now that things played out the way they did. And yeah, we're seeing it in Bitcoin firsthand. It's an exciting morning to be talking, man.
It's incredible. It really is incredible just how fast things can change. And that goes to the explosive exponential nature of Bitcoin. And so I want to tangent really quick. And because I would really like for you to explain Bitcoin price and, how price works at the margin. And this is something I don't think people understand really quick. And then I want to come back to some of the I don't know, G7, but just Trump, what the administration might do with Bitcoin and some of the laws surrounding that. However, I would love for you to really quickly explain how this can be so explosive or why Bitcoin can be so explosive while touching on how the price of Bitcoin is determined. Because again, that's something, whether it's housing, I mean, anything works like this with market makers and buyers and sellers coming together and price discovery. So I'd love for you to explain that to people who might not know or just need a refresher on how that works. And again, why that makes Bitcoin so explosive.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's true for any market, but for Bitcoin, probably even more so. And I think the key thing that you touched on is that price is determined at the margin. And, this is true for commodities. This is true for a commodity like oil. If anyone was following the markets in 2020, for example, when the pandemic started and the economic shutdown started, the price of oil just tanked. And it doesn't really make sense, right? It's like no one was forecasting that oil was worth zero, right? No, we all know that oil is the most, valuable physical commodity in the world, but the price went so low because on the margins at that point in time, people were flush with oil and they knew that it was not going to be used in the near term. So the price can get really dislocated. So that's what happened with an asset like oil. There's similarities with an asset like Bitcoin. Prices are determined on the margin. So if there's a big buyer in the market, there's this concept of an order book. So there's people who are putting out sell orders that they're willing to sell their Bitcoin at a certain price. And there's people putting out buy orders that they're willing to sell X quantity of Bitcoin at a certain price. And basically just think of like the buy orders kind of just like chewing up all the sell orders. And that's really what's been happening for the last, 48 hours or really the last week, where the sell orders are coming in and someone's saying, I'll sell, whatever it is. So these would be big amounts, tens of Bitcoin, hundreds of Bitcoin on an exchange's order book. And then there's a big buyer, multiple big buyers in there saying, we'll buy that, we'll buy that, we'll buy that. So, and that keeps pushing up the price because people see this action, and then they say, okay, maybe I'll sell a little bit more. It was kind of like a funny quip on Wall Street when the price of an asset would go up significantly in the short term, and someone would say, why did this happen? And of course they say why. They're really looking for like a fundamental answer explaining it, but then somebody would just say, oh, there's more buyers than sellers. Like it's just like repeating what's actually happening, but like that's what it is. And so that's what's happening at the order book level. But I do think it's more interesting to talk about what's happening at the fundamental level. And that's where I think it's the nation state adoption or just I don't think it's only nation states buying at this moment in time. It's the signal that presents to everyone. And other people I think are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, Bitcoin is, $1.6 trillion asset roughly at today's price. And, pick your comparable asset, but gold is still about 10x as big. And, with all these things happen, that seems like a mispricing. And, the proper pricing, it's not 80K, it's not 90K, it's not 100K. So people are looking at that and saying, this is a good time to buy. Could Bitcoin drop to, 75K this week, 70K? Sure, it could. But I think people are looking at it and saying, I think I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be happy having bought at 83K or whatever we're at now. When I look back, 3 months from now, 12 months from now, whatever it is. So that's what I think is happening. And I made the comparison to gold, 10X, but a huge narrative that Bitcoiners have been talking about is that Bitcoin is going to soak up value from other assets. It's not just from gold. It's from real estate. It's from passive investing in stocks. It's from seeing that bonds are likely not going to be a great investment on a real basis, probably for a decade, if you ask me. They haven't been they've been terrible for the last 4 years. I think that continues to play out for another 5 to 10 years. So all of that money, it's kind of, think of it like a competition. That money has to kind of go somewhere, and a lot of it's going to flow into Bitcoin. So yeah, I think people like to use the innings analogy here, but we are still early in this game for sure.
Do you think so? In saying that, before we kind of go back to some of the nation state stuff and what the Trump administration might do, what are your thoughts on the diminishing returns? And that's one of the quips that you see now. It's like, oh well, it can't go up that high because of diminishing returns. It can only take so much off of the other asset classes. It can only people are always going to want to sell. Miners are always going to want to sell. Whales, people that hold more are always going to want to be selling. So there's always going to be sell pressure. What do you say when people come with that objection?
I think they are too early with that analysis, with that claim. I think there will come a time that is correct, but I think we're talking like Bitcoin's probably 10x from here to say that. There was this interesting pattern for the last few cycles where if you looked at a prior cycle's trough, the low point, and then looked at the next cycle's high, and then whatever that multiple was, it was kind of being reduced by 4/5 each time. So that was diminishing returns for sure. But then if you held that pattern true for this cycle, it was only going to mean that Bitcoin was going to go 4x from 4 to 5x, call it, from the previous low point. So previous low point was only 2 years ago, which is insane, by the way. We should probably just point out, how crazy is it that FTX was 2 years ago? Like, I remember being at Thanksgiving with my family, and this is my extended family who, like, I don't talk to every day, right? And they knew I left Goldman Sachs to work in the world of crypto to them. And they were just like, "Oh, John, I feel so bad for you." So that was only 2 years ago. Um, anyway, Thanksgiving is going to be very different this year. But, 16K, that was the previous low point. That pattern of diminishing returns was going to show 4 to 5x, call it like 65, 70K, if that pattern held true. We're blowing through that pattern right now. So when someone says diminishing returns, they could mean it different ways, but at least in that particular pattern of diminishing returns, like, it's already done. I just don't think, I don't see diminishing returns happening in a world where all those things I mentioned, nation states, institutions, financial advisors, hedge funds, etc. If I said financial advisors, individuals, they have not really even put 1% in a serious way. So there's going to come a time where we say, yeah, diminishing returns to Bitcoin, but I think we are far, far from that.
So going back to the Trump stuff and what the administration might look like, do you think that, there's been all kinds of stuff going on, scorched earth mentality, which is the camp I kind of rely in. That's a different talk for a different day, probably. But, that legal tender is obviously on the block here, a potential. There's capital gains removal. He talked about 1031 ability at, I think it was in Nashville, when we were all in Nashville. He talked about that in his speech. The strategic stockpile. What do you think gets done? Does it all get done? None of it. It feels like the pressure now. We're in a different era now. It does feel like that, where it's like, oh, you're the media now. It's felt like that for a while to a degree, but now it's becoming obvious. I think that the Bitcoin cohort at least, is so loud, seemingly, that it's just going to keep gaining momentum here because of price. What do you think gets done in the Trump administration when it comes to those different, how it looks at Bitcoin?
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see what actually gets done. I'll speculate a little bit. Some of this, probably higher confidence than others, but
if you're liking this interview, but you're just wondering, you know what, Brandon, this is amazing stuff. And I get you have these guests on and they're talking about how orange pilling the world is so great and how Bitcoin is going to take over the world. How in the world do I educate my family and friends? How do I get people to understand what most people just don't care about, quite honestly? Bitcoin trading cards is the way to do that. When you open up these cards, you see the foil cards, you see the chase, you see the glossy cards, young, old, boy, girl, man, woman, it doesn't matter. People love these cards. It's awesome because they're super valuable, by the way. Amazing little side note. However, it Trojan horses them into the most important thing of the day. It's not politics. It's not all the things that we fight about. It's changing the money, fix the money, fix the world. Bitcoin trading cards is the best way that we have going in order to do that, no matter who you are. You're gonna love them. Playable Characters 10 for 10% off at checkout. Playable Characters 10 off at checkout. btc-tc.com. You're going to absolutely love these things. Now back to the show.
I don't think we see a full just like removal of capital gains taxes on Bitcoin. I just have a hard time seeing that, because these people in power still do care about what they would call financial stability. Like, they don't want to see a flight out of the dollar denominated assets into Bitcoin. If Bitcoin could double, triple, quadruple from here, that's the crazy thing. It still is a drop in the bucket, really, compared to the dollar system. So that doesn't really threaten the dollar system. But if it happens too quickly, those powers that be could start to maybe worry that there's going to be a flight out of the dollar. And they don't really want that. So I don't think they want to signal and say, hey, Bitcoin's legal tender, it's on par with the dollar, zero capital gains taxes. I have a hard time seeing that happen. What I could see happen, and this actually was proposed in the Cynthia Lummis, Kirsten Gillibrand bill. I think they proposed it in 22 or 23. The keyword, it got proposed, so none of this got passed, but it still was a proposed bill. I think their number was somewhere around $200 that they said, if you're buying a round of beers, if you're buying dinner with your friends and the restaurant allows you to accept Bitcoin, allows you to pay in Bitcoin, there's no capital gains taxes, which is pretty nice because, let's say you buy a few beers. Do you really want to calculate that you have a $2.72 capital gain on that transaction? That's just like a headache for everybody. So that would be good. And then the government, if it gets used the right way, they're not going to miss out on a lot of capital gains if they just have that low threshold. But I think what they still want is, some guy or entity that made, literally hundreds of millions of dollars off Bitcoin. I think the government is still going to want a chunk of that. They still get capital gains off stocks. They still get capital gains off real estate. I don't think they're looking to just like give that all away on Bitcoin. But I don't think that's a huge problem. If you want Bitcoin to excel as a medium of exchange, you just have some sort of threshold for payments. I think that kind of solves that. And more importantly, I think what really we want to see from the government at large would be protections of self-custody, which Trump has said so far. And that's a shift away from what Trump and Mnuchin did in 2020. If you guys remember, there was this talk of everyone being deemed a broker. So it was like, oh, the hardware wallet manufacturer is a broker, and they're going to have to collect KYC information about all their clients. And, oh, if you can't collect it, then, you're operating illegally. And it was like a de facto ban on self-custody. So making sure that doesn't happen is critical. And this is similar, making sure everyone doesn't get deemed a money transmitter, because then it's like, oh, you have to have a license, you have to collect all this information. Oh, you can't do it, then guess you can't operate. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. Protecting Bitcoin mining, we want to protect that, make sure they don't have some crazy negative legislations or taxes, penalties on them, which again, Trump has said. So I think those are more likely to play out. I don't think there's a real threat to the government by them saying, yeah, you can self-custody your Bitcoin. I still believe they're going to monitor and make sure that centralized exchanges collect KYC information. And when someone sells Bitcoin on a centralized exchange, I absolutely believe the government is going to expect that person and the exchange to report that activity to the IRS. And if you have a big gain, you're going to pay your taxes. Like, I fully expect all of that to happen. But yeah, I don't think there's a huge threat to the government saying, yeah, you're allowed to self-custody your Bitcoin. Yeah, you're allowed to be a Bitcoin miner in the US. And in fact, we want you to be a Bitcoin miner in the US because it's good for employment and it's actually good for energy infrastructure, for developing renewables, for consuming wasted energy. I think that story is only in like the first inning of playing out. People like Daniel Batten, Pierre Rochard, there's a long list of people have been really doing a good job at telling that story. But I think we're just in the first inning of that Bitcoin energy connection playing out. So yeah, that's kind of what I would think is more likely versus unlikely for the government to do under the Trump administration. But do you think I missed any items of like what they might cover from a regulatory perspective?
The only other ones I was thinking, we talked capital gains, was like 1031, stuff like that, which would go along those lines of, hey, it's property still, right? Like, it's deemed property, so why can't you 1031 it like you would real estate? I think that was, it kind of goes a lot. If those things happen, I think that probably gets rolled in there, I would imagine, especially if there's capital gains. I would imagine like under or over a certain amount. Feels like that would be I'll say this though. This is my kind of next question though. It feels like, because I think I feared that you were right. There's always this great sense of like hope and optimism in the beginning, and then it's 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, and then you're just kind of like lost into like the next midterm thing. Now I think this team of people, I've never seen a team of people like this around a president before, that are entrepreneurial, they are forward thinking. Maybe, and if someone can correct me, I'm not a savant with every single American president administration, but since the founding fathers, something like that, where you have all these entrepreneurs, all these people coming together with that foresight, it feels that way. And I think it's going to disillusion people. This is my fear, that if we aren't going to not go scorched earth, but if you're not getting all these things done, it's going to really be an interesting world a year or two from now, a couple of years from now, if it's like, kind of like how Barack Obama was, I think, for the left in a way. Like, wait, you didn't do more, and kind of demoralizing that side. It's going to have this weird effect, I think, on libertarians, on Republicans, where it's like, wait, we had control of everything, and you had all this groundswell of mandate, and you only did what? The IRS is still here. You're like, what are we doing? The income tax and the IRS and the Fed Reserve all came at the same time. We got to get rid of at least two of the three. And these are fights that, really no one wants to have, especially in DC. So I don't know. I fear you're right, John. I guess my question to you is, what does it take at some point? It feels like we're trying to play both sides of the fence here. And that's where I feel like government is going to be, and just constantly is, where it's like, well, it's not legal tender, but you don't get, cap gains under 200 or something like that. But it's like, are we just going to be here again 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 12 years from now, where it's like, oh, we have another censorship situation and all of our bank accounts are locked out. So, yep, finally realize we need Bitcoin. It feels that way. It feels like the Bible, where it's like, we learned for the 3,000th time, like we forgot about God, we forgot our humility in essence, and now we got kicked in the face, and we realized truth again. So I'm going on a rant now, but that's what it feels like, because I fear you're right. I fear that you are correct, and that's the route we're going to go.
No, I hear you, man. And this brings up a really interesting topic, which is dollar. Just talking about the monetary aspect, because we could get into a lot of different things about what the Trump administration and the team has said they're going to do, what his supporters think he's going to do, and will it live up to all of that? Because there's a lot of different categories of things that have been talked about and people are expecting. But just focusing on the monetary side of things, it gets into this topic of dollar and Bitcoin coexistence. And, we've debated this on Cafe Bitcoin and Swan Signal, till the cows come home. And like, people have different thoughts on it. And it's like, how quickly is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? Is it going to happen in my lifetime, our kids' lifetime? And people have different views. And I get that. I'll just tell you where I'm at on that. And I'm in the camp that the dollar system will coexist with Bitcoin for a long time. And I'm not so sure that that's a bad thing. Not for the reason, I'm fully against central banking, fiat currency, fractional reserve, fully against it. But it is the system that's here. And if someone gave me full power, and Trump and Ron Paul came to me and said, John, you can do whatever you want to do to the financial system, I don't know if I would say, let's just nuke the Federal Reserve right away, because it's almost like you have a problem. It might be obvious by now that you shouldn't have done X activity, but you did it. So you have to it's here. You kind of have to deal with it. Like the military example would be Afghanistan, maybe in 2021, when our administration pulled out and it was an absolute disaster. You could be correct in saying, hey, maybe we never should have been there. But that doesn't mean you can just like exit and think everything's going to be fine. You have to be strategic about how you reverse things. So I'm in the camp that there's just the US dollar system has been entrenched for so long that I don't think we can, or we even want to just like nuke it and say, hey, we're going to Bitcoin. And then, by the way, this brings up another tangent, which is, could Bitcoin even handle that? Like the whole like Bitcoin scaling and Bitcoin payments is not there right now. And I don't think we want, 8 billion people in the world on custodial Bitcoin payments, because that's the only thing that works for 8 billion people right now. So I actually think you probably couldn't get rid of the dollar system even if you wanted to that quickly, and it might not actually be a good outcome if we tried to do it too quickly. So my view is the dollar system keeps chugging along for quite a while, and Bitcoin just keeps growing and growing, and it's not going to be growing in a straight line. We're in one of these times where this is like a step function higher in terms of adoption, but I don't think it means the dollar system goes away anytime soon.
Yeah. It just makes me think of the stable coin. I feel like here in America, like the Tether stuff, it doesn't get as much play, I feel like, here, just because we have the dollar, obviously. And so we kind of like live our lives in that. But if you're around the world, obviously you live with the dollar generally a lot of places in the world, but they're using a lot of Tether now. And so this is something I feel like Americans we don't really think about, we don't really grasp. It's kind of like, oh yeah, like Tether's out there. I kind of forgot about that. Like it's like we just thinking like Bitcoin or like the dollar, and that's it. So yeah, it just makes me think of that, and that the dollar hegemony, which is, to your point, probably entrenched even more with Tether, right? Like it's not all, I mean, you have the euro dollar, you have the dollar. I mean, you have like this legacy system, then you've got the Tether, and what that's doing is entrenching it almost more in a way. I would love your thoughts, just kind of how you see and think of those different currencies kind of being used and coming together.
Yeah, man. And that's a really good point. And because it brings up this idea that there are forces that are further entrenching the dollar. Like if we look at it myopically, just like, hey, Bitcoin's displacing the dollar. That's like true in a narrow sense, but it's not like the dollar's doing nothing to further entrench itself. Like it still is the best network effect currency. And you brought up stablecoins. And that's not just like a Twitter theory that stablecoins are entrenching the dollar and treasuries. Paul Ryan talked about this like several months ago. And actually there was a hilarious quote in like a Wall Street Journal article, because it was Paul Ryan referencing some like crypto platform to talk about how many stablecoins were out there. And I'm pretty sure it was called DeFi Llama. And I was just reading this sentence, is like, Paul Ryan, points out that there's this much stablecoin usage per DeFi Llama. And I was just like, never in my life did I think Paul Ryan and DeFi Llama would be in the same article. So that was hilarious. But like, it makes the point that he was pointing out that these stablecoins, they're a digital dollar, but what do they own on the other side of that digital dollar? They own treasuries, like vast majority. So they're serving as a source of further demand for treasuries that further entrenches the dollar. And like you said, the people who are using Tether or whatever stable coin it is, that's more people using the dollar, getting used to the dollar, pricing their things in their country in the dollar. So the dollar is actually further entrenching itself. So again, I don't see that really completely reversing anytime soon. And I do want to read a Lynn Alden tweet on this topic, because I'm in the Lynn Alden camp on this one. Balaji Srinivasan posted this a few days ago. He goes, and this is the Powell thing that you and I talked about right before we started. Balaji points out Powell refuses to step down. Ending the Fed should be job number one for the new president. And all the reasons I gave as to why I'm not sure that's even really doable in any sort of clean way. But then Lynn responds and says, the official GOP 2024 platform, unlike the Paul Ryan era, is to not cut Social Security, not cut Medicare, or change the retirement age. Between that, defense spending, and interest expense, that already is equivalent to tax receipts in the US. And the Republicans arguably want to cut tax receipts. So now you get into this situation where it's like, you want to end the Fed, but you're probably in a situation where the Fed's going to have to step in and buy some treasuries at some point. And the Fed itself put out a report earlier this year that said, yeah, we expect to be buying treasuries at some point in 2025. So I don't think there's any sort of clean way to just be like, let's end the Fed and keep this system running kind of as it is.
Wild. Yeah, just wild times. It makes me think of, what's been making the rounds a little bit as well, which is just the melt up scenario, and I think you and I have talked about this over the last few years. I mean, for a long time, I was waiting from really probably 2010 to 2020. I was waiting for things to just collapse again. I guess 2019, the treasury market, the repo market, seizing up, that was kind of like that next iteration of it. But I thought we'd go back to like the dead cat bounce of 2012. Like, here's the bottoming, prices go down again. It's like this deflationary event where it's like, okay, like younger people get to scoop things up because the older people screwed up, and like, yay. Like, and now it's just like, no, we're in melt up land, and it's never going the other way. It's Ben Bernanke, his 2002 paper, deflation, why it can't happen here. It's the 2012 IMF paper of financial repression. Like, they seem very locked in now of like, no, we're only going one direction. And this is played out now. It's like, fool me once to the central bankers, and like, this isn't happening again. So it's just like constant melt up scenario leading back to the Bitcoin price can just go exponential because there's very little supply and there's a finite supply. So it's such a wild time. So touch on any of that if you can, but I want to go a little bit too, because you touched on like, where do we go from, like we have this media narrative, like a progressive, I don't even know if I want to say progressive or liberal, because those aren't even the right terms anymore. Those are such bastardized terms. It's really communist or Marxist terms, and they've been co-opted. But like this narrative of like cutting things, and again, we're in a debt-based system, so you can't really cut stuff. However, people look at tax cuts as like, well, that's just adding to the debt. Like it's the government's money. It's like, no, that's the people's money. Like the government is just leeching off of the people. That's how this game works. And no one seems to understand that. So you have an administration that's coming in, and they want to tax people, or they want to cut taxes. And then they want to cut spending potentially, or at least they say they do, cut departments. And are we going to see, like, what is your prognostication on inflation? Are there going to be even bigger debts? Now, the Treasury has to come in, and, this outside private entity is going to have to, buy things up just to, like, how is this all going to work going forward in your eyes? Where are we going to see $50 trillion debt in a year or two? It could be at $100 trillion here in a few years. Like, how do you see this all like playing out? This wild game we're in right now.
Yeah, I am on the nothing stops this train.
Melt up train.
Yeah, I am, because I think I'm in the camp, and it's interesting because Trump and Elon have talked about Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, which is hilarious that they got that to work. But I see them cutting bureaucracy. I see them cutting regulations. I see them cutting some stupid law that's been on the books for 40 years and has no reason to be on there, but no politician cared enough or could get it removed. I see them getting that stuff removed. But again, I'll just, point back to what Lynn has, just been pounding the table on. The biggest things we spend money on in this country, it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and interest expense. And the Republicans are not running on cutting that. We could debate whether that needs to be cut, but that's not what they're running on. And I think if they tried to run on, hey, we're going to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, like, you probably have Kamala Harris as president right now, because enough people would have just said, NFW, I don't want my entitlements cut. So to me, it's almost like a moot point, because I think neither party is running on cutting. So you have all this spending, and I think you just look at the ways that you can reduce debt, and it's basically you either grow out of it, so you grow your GDP. But that doesn't reduce the debt. It just reduces the debt to GDP ratio. But that, helps the fiscal situation of a country. So you grow out of it, you spend less, you tax more, or you inflate it away. And I don't see us really spending significantly less. I don't really see us taxing significantly more. So that leaves options 1 and 4, which are economic growth and inflation, debase the currency. And importantly, after World War II, we did all 4 of those things. We did, and the 4th one we did in a pretty major way. I think it was easier to get over the populations to pull the wool over their eyes, so to speak, because like information didn't flow as freely. It was all for like the common cause of World War II, and the Fed capped interest rates at pretty low levels, while inflation.
More of a homogenous country.
When I say low levels,
yeah.
Say again?
The country's even more homogenous, now then than it was now too, right? Which makes things easier, public sentiment.
100%.
Yep.
100%. Yeah. So the playbook was run post World War II in a pretty major way, and that got the debt down. But the huge difference there is that the spending we did post World War II, we reduced the spending because our spending was acute. It was on a war. The war ended. We were on the winning side of the war. Our spending now is on domestic, it's redistribution. Let's just call it what it is. And again, no one's running on cutting the redistribution. So I'm of the belief that inflation is going to run hot, meaning something north of 2% on average for, a decade or more to come. And actually, just bringing it back to the recent election, it is going to be interesting to see how Trump deals with, let's say CPI prints, 5%, 6% in his first term. How's he going to talk around that? Is he going to blame the previous administration? Is he going to say, hey, this is happening, but look how great economic growth is. Wages are going up. You guys are better off. It's temporary. There's a lot of different ways to talk around it. But I'm pretty sure what the Trump administration is not going to do is say, look at all this inflation. We need to cut entitlement spending and jack up interest rates. So, if you're not willing to do that, then I think you get into the melt up, more debt, more inflation, and you can still have economic growth at the same time. That's what I think the Trump administration is going to try to do. But there is not a fiscal conservative, looking to slash spending in office right now. Yeah. So yeah, I'm much more in the higher than average inflation, debt goes up, nothing stops this train, Cam.
Yeah, it feels like the only way out. And again, this isn't. It could be whoever in there. It doesn't necessarily. You probably have the best guy. At least it's my opinion, the best guy for this scenario, right? Because it feels like the only way out is just unleashing the American private sector, right? I mean, that's the only real way. Like you said, you're not going to get the debt down because it's a debt-based system. So the only way out is to decrease debt to GDP by unleashing innovation, right? It's AI, it's robotics, 3D printing, nuclear, open. I'm sure there's going to be 10 pipelines going the day he gets in the office, right? So like all these things are going to start happening that to me feel like it's going to mask the inflation almost, right? Like you're going to have so many like bells and whistles going. I feel like it's going to be like an overwhelm of like, oh my gosh, can you believe that's happening? Can you believe that's happening? And that, Bitcoin's doing this and robotics and AI. Like, does it feel like that to you? Because it feels like, again, it's like the only option in a way. So it's going to be the only scenario to really kind of play itself out. And it's going to be hard to ignore. You can't sit there and be like, wow, I don't really care about those advancements in technology or, like we're going to be there. It just feels like that's the only way to really go about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that really is the only option, especially when you look at the people that we're talking about here.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not the Paul Ryan, let's be conservative and slash spending.
Yes.
That's in the past.
There's no plan for growth. It's just cut. Yeah, that's like the old conservative. Yeah, yep.
Exactly. And what I think is interesting will become, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think bells and whistles, Trump's going to try to highlight, look, okay, fine, CPI printed 5.5%, and that's not great, but look at how great the economy is growing. Look at all these factories that are being built in the U.S. Look at these jobs that are coming back to the U.S. Trump loves talking about the stock market being at all-time highs, which that's something I don't love that he does, cheerleading the stock market, because I think that's actually an engine for unnatural wealth concentration. And that gets to the point I wanted to raise, which is, what I worry about this future scenario we're describing is, what about the roughly 30 to 40% of households in the US that have like virtually no holdings of stocks? In this melt up scenario, those people are getting left behind, at least on a relative basis. Maybe their income is better. Maybe their wages are better because there is more activity happening in the US, but we don't really want this system where, the S&P is pumping by like 15% per year. That's not really a good sustainable system. So, and that brings up another interesting point, which is like, how would a Trump administration deal with that? And I'm not really sure I know the answer. I know how a more left wing administration would deal with it. They'd say tax the wealthy, redistribute it, do these things of like, they said, we'll give you this much money for a down payment on a home. Yeah, stimulus check type of stuff. I agree with the incentives or the motivation. I don't agree with those policies being very good, but I'm not really sure what a Trump administration would say if the bottom 40% feels like they're being left behind in this melt up scenario. What does a Trump administration do? I'm not really sure. I don't have a high conviction view on that.
Yeah, man, oh man. And it's, again, I think he's the best the best guy for this job in this situation at that time being. Like you said earlier, you alluded to, if he won 4 years ago, things would be very different. Like you said, Elon, like all these things would not have happened. People would have not come. People say like, oh, we need to come together as a society, or you need to have you always hear like the bipartisan, we got to be, bring people together and have a bipartisan coalition. Wake up and smell the coffee. And there's a bunch of Democrats. I mean, you got, the Joe Rogans of the world, the Elon Musk, the Russell Brands, the Tulsi Gabbards, the RFKs. They're all there. They're in the administration. I mean, they're doing things together now. I've never seen anything like it. And so you have this coming together because of the last 4 years, because of what the country went through. But again, at the same time, to your point, and some of what we've been talking about, he was also the guy suggesting negative interest rates, right? I mean, what was this? Was that 4, 5, 6 years ago? I can't remember exactly when that was, but he was the guy, to your point of like, hey, I think it's going to kind of keep going this direction. He was the guy the only person I know of really in America so far, at least at that level, that suggested negative interest rates, which is a whole, another topic for a different day, I guess we can touch on it. But you have that. What do you think though? And again, we're prognosticating, which is, I guess, our job and your job to do in a sense, and the things that we're studying. But what do you think, like what would go up in prices? What would go down? Because I feel like you're going to have this divergence and this, not bilocation. That's being in two places at once. Like we're, like Padre Pio or something, but I'm trying to think. It's just like a divergence of prices almost, where you said like asset prices go up. There's got to be some prices that are coming down, right? Like if you have technology, these growth, if it's nuclear, I mean, nuclear, you can't just like start it up right now. But in your mind, what do you think that there could be? It just feels like you're going to have, which I guess is always the true, but you're always going to have prices, in different places going different directions. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of this off the top of my head, and just makes me think of so many different things. I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that stuff, but I think it is important to just kind of reflect on what he is and what he isn't, and the people that he has together now, like you alluded to. We haven't seen anything like it, and it's going to be a growth world. So do with that what you may, I guess.
Yeah. I think pursuing growth for sure is high up on Trump's priority list. And he's a real estate developer, so, and you mentioned the interest rates, right? Like he talked about negative interest rates. As a real estate developer, they love low interest rates in general. Borrow, finance a project, build, get people in, develop an area. That's their MO. And I think that's how Trump thinks. So, that's a polar opposite world from, hey, inflation's running hot, let's jack up interest rates, Paul Volcker style, and, nip this inflation thing in the bud. Trump does not want that at all. Now, on the flip side, what might be constraining him a little bit is I think he's well aware that he does not want a repeat of what happened under the Biden administration, where pretty much all of the country is just looking at prices and saying, oh my gosh, this is what it just cost me to fill up my tank. Oh my gosh, this is what it cost me to go to the grocery store, go to the same restaurant, smaller portions, higher prices. Like people are just seeing it everywhere. Buying stuff for their kids, going to the dry cleaner. All of this stuff is just, shooting up in price. I think Trump is well aware that he does not want that scenario to happen. So how does he deal with that? I think it is just touting all of the things he's doing for the country as a whole. And he probably looks at things much more on a real basis than a nominal basis, I would think. So in his world, I think he's banking on wages for the lower cohort of wealth to go up more than whatever CPI is printing. So if CPI prints, 5 to 6, I think Trump is banking on the fact that in his world, wages are going to go up at least 5 or 6, maybe more. And he'll say, sure, CPI printed 5 or 6, but look at all these amazing things I did. Look at these factories. Your wages are going up, blah, 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 blah. I think that's how he gets around it. But we'll find out in a year. I think we are going to find out, because we're not, in my mind, it is really low likelihood that we see inflation at 2% for years and years in a row.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point, I mean, he's a jobs guy, right? I mean, that was his big thing last time. He was just unleash innovation. I mean, at some point you do have to let the free market do its thing. You have to decrease, regulations. You can't be hamstringing all the businesses, and you have to unleash that. It feels, well, who knows what the minimum, there's so many social pressures now, right? Whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent, a lot of it's emotion, right? So like you said earlier, the thing to do, the right thing to do is, you can't even do it sometimes. Like we said, like getting rid of the Fed. Yeah, that's common sense. Like, yeah, we should do that. However, in reality, how do you do that? We're in this weird world where it's like the minimum wage. Like in reality, the smartest thing to do would be to get rid of the minimum wage, let the free market do its thing. But can you imagine the backlash, right? Like it would have to work its way through the system a little bit, and the backlash would be so severe because the average person, unfortunately, doesn't understand the dynamics of it. So how do you wade through things like that? That's where it just feels like it's, and this is, again, problems even beyond Trump that we're going to have to be dealing with and persisting. What do you think? In saying that, what do you think, like MicroStrategy, for instance, like a Saylor, he's obviously got the playbook going for, like this made me think of, because you were talking about real estate, right? Like Trump's a real estate guy. Real estate people did very well last time under Trump. And, in real estate, it's a lot of, like you said, it's cheap debt. It's the if people hear of the BRRRR strategy, that's like the famous acronym over the last 10 years people have used for buy a property, raise money, refinance it, rehab it, then rent it out and repeat. And that's kind of what Saylor's doing in essence, right? He's doing that strategy through his company, through debt and equity, raising money, and then buying Bitcoin with it. Instead of buying property, buying physical property, he's buying digital property, and then he's doing that same process. So number one, I would love for your take on what you see with other companies starting to develop that strategy. But how do you think this world of, lower rates, or Fed's already, we were touching multiple things here, but the Fed's already starting to lower rates here. Trump, we know, likes lower rates, inflation running maybe a little bit hotter. How does this affect what Saylor's doing and maybe what other companies are doing with Bitcoin itself?
Yeah, I think Saylor will continue to be a unique player in the Bitcoin for corporation space, because they're like, their legacy software business, enterprise software business, it exists. They have clients, they have revenue, but it's a tiny fraction of how much Bitcoin they own, and Bitcoin going from 70 to 80, whatever, additional value that is giving to MicroStrategy, that's just dwarfing whatever their enterprise software business could do, right? So like, for all intents and purposes, it's a Bitcoin holding company. And Saylor has said this himself too, because I think he's been asked a similar question. He's like, do you think other companies are going to copy MicroStrategy? And his point is, it's almost impossible for them to do it, because they would have to kind of leave, but they can keep their legacy business, but it would have to be so small in comparison to how much Bitcoin they buy. If Apple buys $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, that's a big number, $1 billion. But when you compare it to how much cash Apple has, how much additional revenue and earnings and cash flow that they do every year, $1 billion is actually pretty small. So Apple could buy $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. That doesn't make them a Bitcoin holding company, right? Like, most of the stock performance is still going to be dependent on how Apple does as a company. So that's, I think companies will buy Bitcoin as protecting the cash that they've already drawn into their business. That's going to happen for sure, but they're not going to become like new MicroStrategies, because they have existing businesses that just, dwarf however much Bitcoin that they could buy. Now that does raise the question, could a small company kind of play the MicroStrategy playbook? And the answer is yes, absolutely. But if a small company is doing it, then, they're not going to be, if you've seen charts about MicroStrategy trading volume, MicroStrategy options activity, it's massive in the TradFi world, convertible debt that they've issued. So some small company could do a version of what MicroStrategy is doing, but they're not going to get to where MicroStrategy is. So I think MicroStrategy is kind of like a really unique entity in this sense, in terms of specifically what they're doing. But if we're just talking about companies buying Bitcoin and putting it on their balance sheet, that's going to happen for sure. And the big one is Microsoft. They have a December 10th shareholder vote where one of the explicit items is should they hold Bitcoin as an asset on their balance sheet. I don't really have a strong view on whether that will pass or not, because I just haven't looked into all the dynamics. If anything, I would probably bet it doesn't pass because I don't know if they're incentivized enough to do it. They're one of the most valuable companies on planet Earth. I don't know if they've gotten all the buy-in from people to do it yet. Maybe they'll surprise me and they'll do it. But anyway, if it doesn't happen December 10th, I think those big cash generating American tech companies will be buying soon, but they're not going. It's not the same dynamic as MicroStrategy, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So we talked about the Fed. Excuse me. We talked about the Fed. Obviously, so yeah, it's gonna be fascinating to see what happens there with Powell. Powell came in with Trump, which is interesting. So that's why you have this weird dynamic now. And going back to the Wall Street stuff, we talked about this a little bit ago, but your past life, we talked about companies a little bit here, just nation state adoption. What about just Wall Street itself? And when does the humility increase enough to where it's, and again, we have, there's ETFs and stuff like that, obviously, but it still feels like just overall we'll say this, I guess. So you go from Wall Street all the way to, like you said, the Thanksgiving table, you still have people all over the place. Like I for instance, anecdotally, I just had a couple of people over the last week or so, like, oh yeah, you're, still talking about Bitcoin, huh? Still doing this and that. Like it's weird, like pendulum, it feels like, because we're all human, whether it's Wall Street or you're at the Thanksgiving table, where it's the fear and greed thing, or it's like jealousy, where it's like, okay, I don't believe that person because of such and such reason. And then when it's happening, it's playing out, it's like, well, F that person, like, it's just like, when does, I don't know. I might have answered my own question, I guess, in a way, but it's just something I've just been thinking about recently. And then it's just been happening more and more this past week. I know you've been dealing with it. We've all been kind of dealing with it, where it's just like, what is going on? And I guess the moral of the story, though, too, I guess to the bigger point is the adoption. It's painful in the sense of, like, you want people to see truth, right? Like, you want people to see the truth in front of them. And it happens so much slower than you think it should, or you want it to, whether it is Wall Street or your friends and family or the people around you. And which is probably a good thing at the end of the day. Like you said, if you just could delete, the IRS overnight, or the Fed, again, that might not be there'd be a lot of shockwaves. So I guess you'd have to deal with those things. But when does it, in your mind, is it 100,000? Is it 1 million? Like, when did people start really being like, wow, like, I was wrong. Like, this is something else. This is different. I mean, do we ever get to that point? Like, what do you think? Like, when you go down this road?
Yeah, I think we might be getting there soon. And I think it'll be a combination of the price plus the US government saying we are holding Bitcoin strategically on purpose. And, whether we're holding 200,000 and we're adding to it, or even forget about the adding to it part, it's just going to be really hard for people to say, wait a minute, the most powerful nation in the world is holding billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, and I'm still saying that it's a joke and it's going to go away. I think that plus the price going to, who knows, $90,000, $100,000, I think is going to make a lot of people say, they might not explicitly admit, hey, I'm wrong about this. But they might just say, oh, wow, this Bitcoin thing is here to stay. So I think we're pretty close to that. But then this also brings up an interesting topic, which is, how do certain people, or like society as a whole, I don't even like using that term because there's no such thing as society as a whole. It's all individual people. But Mauricio Di Bartolomeo of a company called Ledin had a conversation with Peter McCormick a few months back. And Mauricio is Venezuelan. And he grew up when Venezuela was relatively free and prosperous. And he literally saw everything change in his lifetime. And I'm not worried that this is going to happen in America. I'm not forecasting that America is going to turn into Venezuela. But what he pointed out that the Venezuelan regime got very good at was making rich people, successful people, the enemy, and convincing people that, hey, you are less well off because that guy over there, because he has a nice car, because he has a nice house. And this is not a one for one analogy, but I think anyone who does well in Bitcoin should just be aware of this, that other people are, if it could happen, America would be the best chance because we, as a country, we have a history of actually liking successful people and not, vilifying them. But unfortunately, some of that has crept into our country. So I think people just need to be aware that there's going to be some people who react to it by saying, and we just saw the ECB paper, right? They said Bitcoin holders are impoverishing the rest of society. That's going to be a narrative that certain people cling to. There's going to be other people who have the classic American view of, oh, you made it, you have a nice car, you have a nice house, good for you. Or even like we apply that in America to not just people who made money, but people who are just successful in general. Like someone who's a elite athlete, an Olympian, pro athlete wins the championship. Like we all cheer for that. We don't say, oh, this is bad because you're successful. But just remember that there's going to be some people in society who twist it and say, oh, because you did well with Bitcoin, you're the enemy now. So it's going to be a mixed bag, but I think we should all be on the lookout for those type of reactions.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And that's where the education is so incredibly important, and living the life that you want to be give off the best example, I guess. I'm trying to think of the best way to say it, but it's, I think of George Gammon in the Jeff Booth debates that they've had numerous times over the last couple of years. And, George's biggest thing, over time, they kind of whittled it down to like, wow, yeah, I mean, we believe the same exact thing, all except one thing, in essence, that, George basically doesn't believe that humans will learn from their mistakes. Like we're just going to repeat the same thing. Like, great, this Bitcoin thing, like it might work out, but like 80 years from now, 100 years from now, the next fourth turning, like we'll just be right back in the same spot because we'll have done the same stupid things, and we'll, whatever, but, too much credit out on Bitcoin, and we're rehypothecating or whatever it is. And people won't care enough about sound money, and which is, maybe he's right, and that's where Saylor, his biggest thing, I know a year or two ago, he said his biggest fear is nothing technically. It's nothing. It's, will people care about sound money? Like, will 100 years from now, will you care about sound money? So, that is a very real thing. So again, you feel free to comment on that at all, but I would like to, we're nearing, the end here, last couple of minutes, but we talked about, Mike Benz before, and just some of the things that he has kind of shown of, which I think is a good way to kind of wrap some of this, whether it's, we talked about JD Vance the other day, which the guy is just absolutely brilliant. We talked about Mike Benz. This was a couple of weeks ago. You and I were talking about this and how he's unearthed a lot of these things that now we kind of know how the deep state, or at least aided us in how the deep state works, and has helped usher in a lot of this new era of education on the deep state. And I think that is, and that's why I brought the George Gammon stuff and some of the stuff you were just talking about, because it's so important to, in order to care about it and really know what's going on, we need that communication. Like we said, 60, 80 years ago, we didn't have the ability to communicate, where now we do, whether it's, we're doing podcasts, or we're doing spaces, or we're meeting in person, the true peer-to-peer stuff. We just didn't have that before. And that's why it's so paramount to continue this and sharing these things out, sharing the spaces, sharing the podcast episodes, because that education needs to continue permeating it. It's not going to happen in government-run schools. And so that's why it's just so huge. So I'd love for you to kind of just give any thoughts you have on whether it's the George Gammon stuff and Jeff Booth, or Mike Benz, or JD Vance, and just kind of this new era of Vivek, this new era that we are really ushering in now.
For sure. Yeah. And this is probably a good one to end on. It's a big one, but it's fascinating. I would say I generally do agree with this idea of like humans make the same mistakes over time. Bitcoin doesn't bring about utopia. I'm all for that. But at the same time, I do believe that there are technological innovations in humanity's history that do permanently alter how things work. And the printing press would be like the prime example. There was no putting that toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. So, Catholic Church had tons of power over society. They abused it. And one of the ways that they were able to get away with it was that, the knowledge and information could not flow quickly and relatively quickly and relatively freely. The printing press changed that forever. It was not like the people who had power over Europe at the time decided and said, "Hey, let's allow the printing press to exist here and to flourish." It just happened. And The Sovereign Individual is a great book for this kind of core thesis. I think Bitcoin will be similar, and credit to Tur de Meester, who made this analogy in a short paper that he wrote called The Bitcoin Reformation. And I think the key point is that sometimes technologies do come about that just permanently alter the path of human civilization. And Bitcoin, I believe, will be one of them. If George Gammon is talking about, hey, there's going to be credit on Bitcoin, platforms are going to fractionally reserve it, I think that is likely to happen. But I think it's more like a Celsius or a BlockFi. And the individual people who use the platform, they got greedy, they got fooled. They had to touch the fire in order to figure out it was hot. They unfortunately lose their shirt. But did Celsius take down Bitcoin? Did BlockFi take down Bitcoin as a whole? Of course not. So I think those platforms will continue to exist because people are flawed. There are Alex Mashinsky scammers out there. That's always going to happen in society. I'm not, predicting that humans lose their kind of flawed nature in that sense. But just because that continues to exist doesn't mean that Bitcoin fails. Those are two completely different things. And then just on the Mike Benz stuff, if anyone wants to hear one of the most impressive people, I'm not exaggerating here, I think Mike Benz is one of the most impressive speakers in terms of communicating a body of knowledge, specific dates, events, people, countries. It's just, he's unreal. The guy's mind is an encyclopedia and he communicates so quickly. Mike Benz on the Sean Ryan show was phenomenal. And the somewhat scary thing is he calls it the blob, but it's kind of like the deep state. And he just talks about how there's been a lot of actions in the past 10 or so years where basically the US deep state blob kind of had this like foreign policy bag of tools and tricks, and they usually turned it outward to in foreign policy. In the last 10 years, they've turned more of it inward. And that's kind of a scary thought for a country like America, where that stuff is never supposed to be turned inward. It's arguably not even supposed to be turned outward, but, definitely not supposed to be turned inward. And, but he did have some reason for optimism because he, at the end of the show, he just noted a few things that were kind of victories. And it's not like we just lose our rights in a clear line as time goes on. Like there are victories. The courts sometimes come to the right conclusion and the government does get limited. So there's reason for optimism. But yeah, we always have to remember that they're kind of competing factions here. And Mike Benz, like I said, just I think super impressive guy. So I would recommend people check him out.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The last thing I was going to ask you, which we kind of, I don't know if we touched on it offline. I was going to ask you about just insights you're having from, Swan private clients or just like, the business in general, people buying Bitcoin. And I think it's kind of just answered and summed up. And yeah, people are hitting you up like crazy right now and asking for, how do I get in here? How do I haven't been in here a while. So I think that suffices for just the answer on that, and the price action kind of gives you what you need to know there. If you want more Bitcoin education like the one you just saw with John Haar, then you're going to love the one we did with one of the biggest Bitcoin educators and macro educators in the space, Mark Moss. Go check that one out here. Come on, check it out. Or you might love the one we did with Luke Mikic and how people are literally going to be retiring with 0.01, 0.11 Bitcoin in the future here, buying houses with that little Bitcoin. We are so early. Go check that one out here. Come on, you're going to love these. I'll see you in there.